Jeremy's War, Chapter 15. Once again we were marching in column, and once again the flutes played British Grenadiers. But now we weren't staring at guns. We were marching into Detroit, and Detroit was ours. We passed through the palisade into the town. The worried, curious faces of women and children peered from the windows and doors of the houses. As soon as I entered, I saw two buildings with large holes in their walls. Our cannon fire had done more damage than I'd thought. Hundreds of Yankee soldiers lined the side of the road. They were throwing their muskets and swords into great piles. Many of them were crying. Some shook their fists at us and cursed. Others cursed their leaders. I noticed a young officer. He was standing a few feet in from the road. Tears streamed down his face. As I watched, he pulled his sword out of its sheath. Crying, he broke the sword over his knee and threw the two pieces into the mud. Most of the Americans just stared at us, their faces blank. They must have been wondering where their great army was that had forced their surrender. Surely they hadn't given over everything to these few soldiers. But they had. Their general had been deceived. He'd been deceived by the militiamen wearing the red coats of the British infantry. He'd been deceived by our cannon into thinking we could batter his fort to dust. Mostly he'd been deceived by a few hundred Indians who looked like a great army and broke his heart with fear. Fort Detroit had surrendered, which meant the British now controlled everything from Fort Michilimackinac in the north to the Ohio River in the south, a land as big as Upper Canada itself. Our army, short on guns, short on ammunition, short on everything, now had thousands of extra guns and dozens of cannon captured from the Yankees to be used against the Yankees. What's more, word was already spreading of a fortune in American gold to be distributed among the men. Rumor had it we were all about to get 6 months' pay, and not one of us had fired a shot. A soldier ran past us, holding a flag. A few minutes later, we saw him on the roof of a building inside the fort, hauling down the Yankee stars and stripes. Up went the Union Jack in its place. We cheered. The Yankees turned their faces away. We passed through the gate into Fort Detroit. The walls were at least 12 feet thick. How would we have got inside? It didn't matter. We walked inside. A dozen British soldiers came out of a large building in the middle of the fort. They were escorting an American prisoner. "It's Hull!" someone called out. "It's General Hull!" I craned my neck to look. He was old and heavy, with gray hair and a gray beard. As he got closer, I saw his face clearly. His eyes were half closed, his head was bowed. His skin was a sick, yellow color covered in a sheen of sweat. He was chewing something furiously. Tobacco. The juice was dribbling out the side of his mouth, straining his beard in uniform. He looked pathetic. "Eyes front!" Stanton snapped angrily. We looked away. As they let him out of the fort, we could hear cries of "Traitor! Coward!" The Yankee troops cursed their general to his face. We formed into companies on the parade ground. A detachment of American soldiers formed across from us. One of them stepped forward carrying a folded banner, the regimental colors of the defending troops. This officer was nothing like Hull. His face burned with anger, pride, and shame. He saluted stiffly and handed the banner to Colonel Proctor, who saluted in return, took the banner, and gave it to one of our men. The surrender was complete. Brock and Tecumseh entered the fort together, side by side, on horseback. The twin generals had come to survey their conquest. Brock owed this victory to Tecumseh. The Yankees' fear of the Indian tomahawks had done more than any cannon could do. As I watched the Shawnee chief, proud but grave at Brock's side, the joy of victory faded out of me. Tecumseh had given Brock Detroit. He had kept his word. Did he know Brock's word meant nothing? That night, back on our own side of the river, we stood around bonfires outside the fort and sang and arm wrestled and drank rum. The officers made a point of looking the other way. I walked about alone, beyond the edge of revelers, holding a bottle of rum someone had handed me. I hadn't been allowed to drink rum with other men before, but now I was a veteran, and no one seemed to care. I took a long drink, and another. It burned my throat and made my gut churn, but my head felt light and free. Brock hadn't sent for me. He seemed to have forgotten all about me. I wanted to forget about him. The battle was over. The local militia would be returning to their farm soon. Maybe I should go with them. I wanted out. The others could sing and tell lies about their bravery when no one fired a shot. I knew the truth. The Indians were celebrating around their own campfires a few hundred yards away. Their shouts echoed across the night air. They had reason to celebrate. They had taken Fort Detroit for us. But really, they had no reason to celebrate at all. If every one of them had died for their nation, they'd still be no closer to getting it. Hey, look! I turned toward the shout. Half a dozen Shawnee warriors were standing at the edge of one of our campfires. The singing stopped. The men stood up quickly. They weren't any less afraid of Indians than the Yankees were. One of the warriors stepped forward silently. He offered a sergeant a belt made of beads and shells braided together. It was called a wampum, and the Indians valued them highly. The sergeant hesitated. "Take it, sergeant," someone whispered. "Quick, before they change their minds." The sergeant reached forward and took the wampum. "Well now, thank you," he nodded. "Thank you." "Give them some rum." "Yeah, give it to them." The sergeant handed a bottle to the warrior. "Here, drink it in good health." The Indian shook his head. One warrior spoke urgently, but he was cut off sharply by the others. "Well now," the sergeant looked to his men and then back. "If you won't drink, you can at least share the fire." He motioned them toward the blaze. The warriors stepped forward slowly, looking nervously at each other. "Play something, Tom. Go on." An accordion wheezed out a jig. The Indians smiled. One of them did a little dance, and everyone laughed. Blood pounded angrily in my head. These soldiers were singing and dancing with the Indians. Part of me said that this was good, that this was how understanding started. But the rum drowned that out. All I could see were these men acting like old comrades toward the Indians, while our leaders were betraying them. It was all fake. It was all unreal. I stepped toward the fire. "This is wrong." No one heard me. I shouted it. "This is wrong." The music stopped. Faces turned to me, glowing in the light of the fire. I moved toward the warrior who had made the gift of the wampum. "Don't you know they're lying to you? They're not your friends. They just want you to do their fighting for them. They want you to fight the Long Knives so that you can win their war and then take your land. For the love of God, Private—" But I wouldn't stop. "You think you're fighting for your homes? We're not going to let you keep your homes. We're lying to you." "Are you crazy? We're lying to you. We're going to take your land just like the Long Knives. We may not fight you for it, but we'll take it just the same. We just need you right now. He's going to start a fight. Someone stop him." The warriors gazed at me steadily. They couldn't know what I was saying, but they could see my expression. Did they understand? How could I make them understand? "We just need you to fight for us," I was crying. "We need you to fight for us so we don't have to fight ourselves. That's all. You should go. You should leave us. Go back to your lands. We're not worth dying for. Fields!" A hand grabbed my arm. I swung around in fury. "Just try to—" "Attention!" An officer's uniform. A command. My mind raged against it, but a deeper instinct obeyed. I snapped to attention. It was Stanton, his face cold with fury. "What's going on here?" "He tried to pick a fight with the Indians, sir." "No, Be quiet." Stanton turned to the men at the campfire. "Perhaps it would be best if the Indians returned to their own people." He bowed to them and gestured toward the Indian fires. The warrior who had given the wampum nodded gravely and spoke to his men. They disappeared into the dark. "The rest of you have had enough celebration for one night. Turn in. Fields, come with me." "Sir, come with me." We walked in silence toward the fort. We were almost at its gates when he wheeled around. "Cannot believe this. We've just won a victory. Our general is a hero, and when he can't find his cufflinks for the victory dinner, he discovers his Batman has disappeared, and I'm sent to find him because I recommended him in the first place. And when I do find him, he's about to start an Indian war. I wasn't. Do you know what could have happened? Do you know how much we need the Indians? What if a fight had started? What if it had gotten out of control? You could have undone everything that was accomplished here today." I couldn't speak. That wasn't what I'd meant. A pain stabbed at my head. I felt dizzy. I'm confining you to the blockhouse, Fields. General Brock will decide what to do with you. He shook his head. I was a fool to place any trust in you. He marched me to the blockhouse and handed me over to the guard. I was placed in a tiny room with a straw pallet. I curled up on the pallet and shut my eyes against my pounding head. He was wrong. I hadn't meant to start a fight. What had I meant? What had I done?